right, everybody. Thank you for tuning in today. You're listening to WRUU LB Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings Community Radio with Global Soul. This is the Adam Messer Show, and I'm your host, Adam Messer. And my special guest for the second half of the hour, or the second hour, is Lenore Hart. Welcome back, Lenore.
Thank you, Adam. Just sitting here hoping we don't get the same thunderstorms you've got.
Yeah, it's pretty cloudy and dark here. Bass, would you mind playing for us? So this is Sebastian Messer, everybody. Thank you, Sebastian. Thank you very much. So, welcome back, Lenore. And last hour we had a nice opportunity to listen to several readings from your new anthology, The Night Bazaar, Venice, with David and Aphrodite. So it's David Poyers and Aphrodite. I'm sorry, I didn't catch Aphrodite's last name. I can't remember it. What is it?
Anagnost.
Anagnost. Okay, it's kind of like agnostic, almost like that.
Yes,
yeah.
Like
is that her real name, or is that like an author's name, like a pen name?
They're all real.
Did she make up a pen name though? Is it like a combination name, or is that her name?
I'm gonna let her explain that real quick.
It's Anagnostakos, shortened to Anagnost.
Oh, okay. So is that Greek
Aphrodite,
or something, or?
It was Chris and Francis Aphrodite, correct? No. Kristen. Kristen the other way around.
Okay,
Aphrodite is the first name.
So, all right.
Francis is far easier to deal with, I guess, in our non-Greek culture. But it's a great author name, I think.
You know, in Savannah, we have a big Greek festival every year. There's a big Greek community here, and they have, oh my gosh, they have such wonderful food and dance. And of course, I'm not sure about this year if they're going to be able to do it or not because of the pandemic. But
yeah, everything's kind of been put on hold for that, so I don't know. Although I know that Tony was on the show last weekend, and that I think that's the same Orthodox church that Tony goes to. So I've heard about those festivals; they sound great.
Oh yeah, it's wonderful. Their food is so delicious. So, so I want to kind of dive a little deeper. Now, everybody, kind of backstory here. If you didn't catch the first hour, Lenore Hart is the editor and also an author with the new anthology, The Night Bazaar, Venice. It's the second anthology in the series. The first one was The Night Bazaar, and so we were listening to some stories, which was pretty cool. I met Lenore this week, and it was just not necessarily random. At first I thought it was kind of random, but we're both in the Horror Writers Association group, and Tony Morris last week had sent me a message about possibly being a guest on the show, and then I got a message from Lenore this week talking about it, and I'm actually booked up through December, so I was like, well, let's try to do like a podcast. And so Lenore and I talked on Friday, and then we scheduled the podcast for yesterday. We did the podcast. We recorded the podcast, and I was going to put the podcast out last night. And my guest for today had something come up with his family and had to cancel. So I was like, hey, Lenore, would you mind being a guest on the show today? And so the timing just kind of worked out really well. So I'm glad, I think life has happy little, like what does Bob Ross say, happy little accidents or whatever. It's kind of like happy little things that, life happens and you're like, hey, So I'm glad that the opportunity came around that we could chit chat today. And really interesting stories that, David and Anastasia. I'm not sorry, Anastasia. Oh my gosh, Aphrodite. I watched this thing last night on the Romanov, so I've got Anastasia on my mind.
Yeah, that would put that in your brain for sure.
Yeah, I should be thinking Aphrodite. But yeah, really interesting stories. And then also the narrator that you have with Madame Vera. So I would like to kind of talk more about the writing process and the editing process, and putting together an anthology. I know is a lot of work, and we were talking about how your anthology is a theme, where it's the bazaar and it's centered around, I think you said either a person, an item, or a service or something like that.
Right, from the bazaar.
From the bazaar.
Bazaar from that city at that time.
Yeah, and I completely agree that having a themed anthology, for me at least as a reader, I like the themed anthologies. Nothing against the other anthologies either, or like you had mentioned about like a collection, the best collection of, best of sci-fi or fantasy or whatever. But I enjoyed it, and that's what I'm doing with my anthology, The Devil's Due, for Valhalla Books. And I picked the same kind of thing. Like I picked a theme, where it's a deal gone, wrong, terribly wrong with a devil of sorts. And, the devil always comes back to collect, and I feel with a theme that it's nice. Yours is even actually more specific because it focuses on the bazaar, and then everything is, somehow or another connected to the bazaar. So what made you decide that? I mean, like you gave a little bit of the backstory on, your daughter being in New York and having a Night Bazaar, and then you checked it out and the name was available, so you trademarked it. So can you talk a little bit more about that? Because, I mean, I know the excitement of like when an idea strikes, it's like, oh man, there's so much around it.
Sure. Yeah, I knew that I wanted, I wanted to do an anthology, obviously. And, I read a lot of anthologies, especially in the fantasy science fiction genre. And, there's lots of good ones that come out, like best stories of the year. And those are always wonderful. And so this is nothing against those. It's not that I don't think that's a good idea. But I wanted this particular anthology to tell a complete story in a way almost like a novel, and I wanted everything to be linked, not too tightly so that it constrained the writers, but rather in a way that by the end of reading the anthology, they had a really clear and vivid idea of what the bazaar was like, and also how it might have influenced things, like over the centuries. Of course, the first one was set in present-day New York, and so a lot of the authors set their stories in the present day. They didn't even necessarily have to be in New York, as long as they had that thing in the story that linked it to the bazaar, whether it was some kind of like a rare object, something inherited through the family, or found maybe even, or stolen even, that figured into the story, or if there was a person, or a family, that had descended from someone who'd worked at that original bazaar. So in the first one, there were a lot of contemporary stories, but a few authors also decided to set them in the past. And what's interesting is this is how it doesn't really constrain the authors, although you would think they would set it in the Night Bazaar Venice, for instance, that they would have to set it either in Venice in the 14th century, or the present day, but some of the stories are even set in 18th century Paris. And yet it's still perfectly
I don't mean to
linked
interject real quick, but I was wanting to know more like when you first had that idea strike.
Oh, okay,
yeah,
sure.
I want to kind of I just kind of want to focus you back on that, on that one.
Sure,
yeah.
I'll stop and keep going. Well, actually, yeah, that's a good question. Like I said, there was the bazaar. My daughter was living in Brooklyn and discovered there was that night market called the Night Bazaar, which was just basically a gigantic flea market for artists and people selling things, and I guess food. There were all kinds of food booths and things that operated for a while in Brooklyn, I think for a few years. It's no longer there. I think they had use of a big warehouse or parking garage, which probably now that they lost their place, so it's no longer there. But it sounded like a really cool thing, and I thought that was just such a great idea in terms of, it had so many possibilities in terms of if you added a mystical element, because some of the people there, she said, were selling things like, crystal balls and fortune-telling stuff, just from their booths, like telling, reading your palm or something like that. But what if that was the whole concept? And the whole thing was, in fact, magical. And, also I thought it would be a great idea if the bazaar wasn't set, the Night Bazaar in Brooklyn was in one place, period. Every night it was, or every weekend, I guess, at midnight it was there. But if the Night Bazaar itself in my story was not constrained by time or space, so that it could appear in other places in the world.
See, that's the part that fascinates me, because the stories come and go. I mean, like, that's what I always think is like the things of the world or the material stuff of the world doesn't really matter, but it's that relationship with it. So like with the idea of, because you fell in love with the idea of the story, what resonated with you to do it, to act on it? Because I mean, as authors, as writers, we get a million different ideas, right? What made this one kind of special and stand out that you were like, yes, this is the one?
Well, there were several things. One, I had the character who runs the bazaar, Madame Vera, was already a character I had created.
Right.
She was not particularly a mystical person. She was a real, she was in some of my realistic stories in a novel that I had partly finished. And she did work in a carnival and tell fortunes, but she was not really a magical fortune teller. She was more like adept at reading people. So there wasn't any magical element there. But she was a character that still kind of haunted me that I wanted to use. And this seemed to be a great opportunity to take her and make her something slightly different, someone who is basically immortal. So even though she's still called Vera and she still has these fortune-telling capabilities, she's also, someone who's basically lived forever in many different guises. And that has always appealed to me. And then the idea that she travels with the bazaar and takes it places and can take it anywhere in any time also greatly appealed to me, because I never have really written a series before. I write novels, but I've not done a series. And one reason I've always thought I maybe didn't want to do a series in terms of novels is I thought I might get tired of having the same characters, perhaps who live in the same place, doing similar things over and over. I like to move on to something new.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that with this concept, that would probably never happen, because you've always got a new place, a new time period, new characters, and new things could happen. So it seemed to me that provided many more opportunities to keep the series fresh and exciting.
Yeah, I think that's a great concept, because throughout history, there's been a ton of different themes or whatever. But also when the idea does hit, like when lightning strikes or, whatever, I feel like it's important to act. So as an editor, and we've got a couple minutes here before I have to do the station ID, but as an editor, when you were saying, hey, this is the theme, this is, it's revolving around this Night Bazaar, how did you approach the authors to solicit stories? And then also, how did you look at the call for, a story? Because if I'm remembering right here, you had friends of yours that were authors that you talked to about it at first, and then you also opened it up, for folks to be able to submit a story idea. So can you talk about like that process as well?
Sure. Yeah. That's right. What happened in that end of the thing is that we thought about, first we decided what it would be like. We kind of wrote up a prospectus about the bazaar itself, what the premise was, and any limitations on it. So, for instance, I'm the only one that writes about my character like as a main character, as a point of view character, although she can appear in the other stories briefly as a side character or something. So there was that. We figured all that out first. So one of the other things we wanted to do when I came up with this idea was to give opportunities to writers, writers we knew and maybe some new writers too. We always have to balance that, though, at the press. It's Northampton House. We have, I think, around 30 authors now, but we're a very small press. I mean, basically, the staff is David and I, and that's it.
Yeah.
So anytime you think about, and I know you know about this, anytime you think about something like doing an open call for stories,
mm-hmm.
That you put out there into the writing world, like, everywhere that you can think of, there's always the possibility that you're going to get hundreds or even thousands of submissions, just depending
mm-hmm.
on how widely you advertise it. So that made us a little nervous because we both also teach, as professors in a writing program. We have our own writing to keep up with and our own editing projects and things.
Mm-hmm.
And so we always try to make sure that we don't get overwhelmed, in any of those three areas, the press, the teaching, or the writing. So we seemed like the best way to go about this, since I'd never done an anthology before, and I wrongly thought, of course, in the beginning it would be much less work than a novel. That turned out differently. But anyway, so I thought, how can we do this that'll keep it kind of under control and yet, bring in some new people? So that's what I decided to do. What you mentioned was I invited certain writers I knew had some interest in the era or the time period or the genre of fantasy, or a few that wanted to try it, that were already published but wanted to try a new genre, and I thought could probably handle that well. So I invited those people, and that included friends or colleagues of mine, and then also Northampton House Press authors at that time. I gave them first crack at it. And then after they had a chance to submit, and I had them submit to me a short synopsis and maybe a page or two of the story, so I could figure out how, because they also had to fit together, they had to work well together. So I did that. Then I started offering it to some of our students who had published, but were looking for a break in publishing, but hadn't done so yet. And then with the second Night Bazaar, I opened it up a little further. And I started advertising it on certain sites online, like one called Women's Books, Women Writers. I put it up there. I think I put it up on the Horror Writers Association site, too, at one point.
Mm-hmm.
By that time, I only had, maybe 3 or 4 slots left, but I wanted to pull some new writers in, and that's what happened. I also encountered a couple of writers in New York City, young writers, that my daughter introduced me to, and I gave them an opportunity as well, and for one of them it was their first published story. So that was nice.
That's nice.
So it's kind of a combination of friends, colleagues, students, and then a few new writers mixed in.
Let me do the station ID because we went over about a minute. Everybody, Thank you for tuning in to WRUU LP Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings Community Radio with Global Soul. That actually is an interesting side topic there. It's almost like casting a movie or whatever, because you're picking out these stories, and what I found when I was doing the anthology, I reached out to authors that I knew, and I had self-published before. I had a story published with a small print press as well, like an anthology story, but I've been writing for the Savannah Morning News I don't know, for the last 6 years or so, with the Due Savannah as a freelance journalist. And so it's all different, like styles of writing, and then working with different authors, they all have different styles of writing. And so what I did was a very similar thing. I opened it up because I asked a certain number of people, and they said yes, some said no because they couldn't do it. But I also asked for, when I did the opening, I asked for a 75-word synopsis, just a very brief synopsis, and then from there, it might have been a 100-word synopsis, but from there I asked for a 500-word synopsis, and then from there I was like, okay, well, I'd like to read your story or whatever. And the weird thing about it was, excuse me, I'm a little choked up here. No, I'm just kidding. I just got something in my throat. The weird thing about it was I had folks sending me stuff because I said it was a themed anthology. I had some folks that sent me stuff that had nothing to do with it, and I was like, why? Why don't you read the submission guidelines? And have you with publishing and being an editor and all that? How do you deal with that kind of thing? If you experienced that a lot, or?
My gosh, yeah. That is a huge problem. I'm glad you brought that up, Adam. It's a huge problem. I mean, and it's not everybody, of course, but yeah, I don't know if people just don't like to read signs or follow directions or whatever. But yeah, I mean, right now we have an open call going on for new books, and it's on the website, exactly what we want and need, and it's still happening. It's not just, with anthologies and stories. It also happens with books. And I guess I don't know, I think maybe it's a combination of inexperience. Somebody's starting out and they really don't understand, how it works, how you submit, or that you have to target submissions carefully, because anybody who really wants to get published, it isn't just a matter of writing the book and making it, or the story, and making it the best you can, getting it in the best possible shape, getting all the errors out, making sure you did research or whatever, and that it's all, really, really ready to go, which is another separate problem when it's not. That's another problem, but that's different. And then let's say they've got that thing ready, and then they go and start looking for places to send it. And I think most people at this point, especially since information is so easy to get now, I mean, in the days before the internet and everything, I think it was harder for people to learn how to get into publishing, how to do the process.
You'd have to buy like a trade book or something like that with a list of them. Yeah. It was a lot more difficult.
You might send a book or something if you know.
Yeah.
But now it's so freely available. All kinds of advice on the internet about the do's and don'ts of submitting work, and how to submit to a press and all that. And yet, people still do that. So you got. I've gotten stories that were like, I asked for novels and they sent me nonfiction.
I just want to be frank about it.
They don't know the difference between a novel and nonfiction.
I really want to be frank about it. I'm not trying to be negative here, but it's hot garbage. To me, it's like it's like don't do it. It's just I'm not saying being a gatekeeper. I'm not trying to be like, oh no. I'm just telling people like, don't do that because it's a waste of time. Because for me, if I'm asking for a specific and this is a couple of people, it's like, did you not read the submission guideline at all? I'm looking for a specific story. I'm looking for a themed story or whatever. And, why go through the trouble? I mean, even sending an email or whatever, why go through the trouble of filling out a form, for the submission if it's not? And I actually wrote back to one person. I was like, hey, where's the devil part here? Oh, there's not one. And I was like, well, so why would you? I mean, did you think it was just going to stick, or what? It's kind of weird because I think when you, not you personally, but like in general, when you put out there that you're doing paid work, you're offering pay for a story. There's like this whole group of people out there that all they want to do is sell a story and move on. They don't care anything else about it. It's just like and I'm like, why? If you're turning and burning stuff. I mean, are you, is it just kind of like, I don't care. I'm going to make, these cheeseburgers today and, tomorrow I'm going to make cheeseburgers and the next day I'm going to make cheeseburgers. I just don't understand that philosophy of like, I get it, fake it till you make it. I understand you got to do, have some confidence in your abilities, but, I feel like it's hot garbage because it's like, no, nobody wants that. Nobody. Even like if I were to throw in a story in an anthology, like let's say for instance, if I were to interject one of my stories into the Night Bazaar and it had nothing to do with the Night Bazaar, the readers would be like, this had nothing to do with the Night Bazaar at all. Why is this story in this anthology?
Right. Not that it would have got past me, but that's a very good point. It was.
Well, let's just say I use my connections with Madame Vera to be like, oh.
So she made an exception for you, and I think that's my theory. That I think maybe what's going through people's heads, if they're thinking about it at all when they do this, is that I just wrote this story and it's really great, and my friends all like it, and so this call for stories says it's got to be about the devil, but my character it's not always just a good guy, so that's sort of devilish, so maybe I'll send it and they'll make an exception for me.
And I was like no, not only no, but please don't contact me again.
And then the bad thing about it, which the submitters may not realize or think about, is when you do that, especially if it's really egregious, like way off base, like if you were looking for devil-themed horror stories and they sent you a soppy romance, the editor's going to remember that. And then they may not want to see anything else from you either. So it's not a good idea. Just to think, I will hopefully send this out in the hopes that they're just going to make an exception and take my story, even though it's not what they're asking for. It can have actually repercussions farther down the road too.
Well, I also put in there I was looking for original unpublished content, and someone had sent me a reprint, and I was like, if it were a reprint, that'd be one thing, But I feel like that's part of the nuts and bolts of editing and writing, and if you're going to submit, because there's a couple different routes for submissions, right? I mean, like you could go the traditional route, you could send your manuscript out or your story or whatever. You could submit for magazines. You could self-publish, and that's another topic I really would like to talk about, because you and I were talking a little bit about this yesterday, but I really would like to talk about that because the face of publishing has changed so much over the last 10, 15 years, and anybody and everybody can publish, which is the good thing, and then the bad thing is anybody and everybody can publish,
Yeah, the two-edged sword, right?
Yeah, and I know some indie authors, who are self-published that are, they're making six figures a year, and they're doing it consistently, not just once and like a one-time shot type thing. And then I also know traditionally published authors who are making $0 because they had a book that published or whatever. I feel like the money part is not as important about it as professionalism. Thank you, Bill. You're the best. Bill Cooper just came in the studio. Everybody, you're a swell guy. How you doing?
I certainly am. Thank you.
So I'm sorry. Back to that. So I feel like professionalism is not necessarily tied to the amount of money somebody is making or not making. So can you talk about that? Because obviously you have your own small publishing house. You and your husband are both professionally developed writers, editors, authors. You've been doing this for a long time. You teach. You also have been published with the big houses. So can you talk about that level of professionalism and what, not necessarily so much the lack of, but what can people do if they're wanting to get, into the business and get their work published either with a small publishing house or a bigger, outfit or self-published?
Well, that's a very good question, Adam, because I think there's a lot of, especially for people coming newly to the idea of publishing, getting published or wanting to be published or just starting, to learn how to write. There's a lot of misconceptions, I think, still, despite all that. We're talking about all the information that's available, but either because they haven't read it or they haven't read the appropriate article that would explain it all to them, they may not understand how all that works, and it has changed a lot over the past 10 or 15 years. 20 years ago or so, it was still, primarily the big houses in New York. That was the heart of publishing, and there were more of them then too. And then there were, smaller regional publishers that sometimes specialized in certain genres or in an area. They would, that would be published about, like, say, the Appalachians or something. And then small presses and, literary presses that do more experimental or literary type things, in poetry. So there's that, and they all have slightly different goals, and, they were looking for slightly different things. But then when the self-publishing aspect came up and, suddenly everybody can be published, that really changed everything. All those things, the larger houses kind of contracted, they got smaller, there's more competition, but the self-publishing versus the traditional thing, I think, is still confusing to a lot of people. And I think one thing that I've noticed is that sometimes people think that what they'll do is, they haven't had any luck, breaking into the market. Say their big goal is to be published by a New York City publishing house. That's their big dream, their ultimate end goal. So sometimes I've run into people who think that if they, get their book together and self-publish it, that then, one of those houses will see it and, suddenly want to snap it up. And that's not really how it works. And then what's the problem with that is, they think they're going to put it up there, sell a few copies, get some good reviews, and then go to a publishing house and sell it. But unfortunately, what they don't seem to realize is that book is already published. You remember you were talking about the guy who sent you a reprint, because it's not new material. That any publishing house, whether it's, medium size or large, once you put your novel or your story collection or whatever up there, like on CreateSpace, and you published it, it's a published work. From then on out, it's not a new book anymore, and that's not how the houses, the traditional houses will look at it. They won't want to acquire it for that reason, because once a book has come out and it's no longer new, they can't get reviews for it, for instance. It makes it very hard to market, and they can't find a market for it, and they can't get, like things going on like with Publishers Weekly and the various review sources won't touch it because it's no longer a new book. Now, of course, there certainly are a few exceptions, and I think this is the thing that causes those people to think they can do this too. Every year we hear about one or two books where, they were self-published and they had all these readers and all these sales, and then they were picked up by Simon & Schuster, and they hit the big time. But we hear about that precisely because it is news. It is the two people.
Yeah, it's so rare. Yeah.
Right. There's 2.4 million. I think I don't know if this is a current number, but it's a recent number that, like, last year, I think something like 2.4 million people self-published books.
Yeah, Amazon puts out about 7,000 books a day, from what I heard.
It's probably gone up even since
might
then.
Have,
but there's that huge pool. So the first thing is, out of that 2.4 million or 3 million or whatever it is now, 2 or 3 people got those book deals. So that's kind of a telltale thing. And so the others and some of those other people who were left in the self-published ranks, they may be doing well. Like you said, they may be making money because they're turning out very quickly. This is how I assume they're doing it. They're turning out very quickly a certain kind of a formula, whether it's a romance or a horror novel or one that they can write a lot of, in the course of a year, they can write a number of books and put them up for sale. And
a guy like Mark Dawson, he's a huge indie author. He's based out of the UK, and I know he's pushing 6 figures, 7 figures a year. Hold that thought. We'll be right back. Sure. We got to do the station announcements, everybody.
This is a message from the Georgia State Department of Public Health. Right now, federal and state guidelines recommend staying home if possible and limiting time in public places as precautions associated with social distancing. The more we use social distancing techniques, the more we reduce the risk of the virus spreading. This is especially important for older people and those with underlying health conditions who are most vulnerable to the virus. More information can be found at dph.georgia.gov.
You are attuned to WRUULP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul.
WRUU 107.5 FM is a new and different listener-supported and all-volunteer community radio station for Savannah. Our diverse broadcast and web programming is supported by generous listeners who value our passion and spunk. We are independent of other media and receive no government or large corporate support. People like you are our largest and most important source of our funding. Go to WRUU.org to find out how you can make a one-time or a monthly contribution. Thank you.
This is
All right, we are back, everybody. So we are on the second half of the second hour, Lenore, and I appreciate you being here on the show. So kind of drilling back into the professionalism. Like I said, I don't really feel sales is necessarily tied to professionalism, although it does help. And there are some people who do rapid release, but I also know traditionally published authors who have deals and they get $0 for marketing, and they don't have advances and that kind of stuff. So it's it's an up or down. I feel like the way people publish, it's definitely not what it used to be. And I wasn't in it back then. I've only been self-publishing the last couple of years. And I decided to do like a small publishing house because of that reason, because I was like, if I'm going to do something, if I want to do an imprint and have a small publishing house and focus on, working with a couple of authors that I like and, that kind of thing, I want it to be as professional as possible. And I'm not trying to, as much as I would love, to sell 1 million copies of a book, I'm not, trying to say, hey, let's, do this. I'm trying to reach those readers that genuinely like it. So what's something that someone could do? And I'm not talking about craft talk, like writing and that kind of stuff, because obviously you got to have a good story in writing, but professionalism as far as like getting into as an author. Let's just say, for instance, one of your authors that comes to your press, right? What are some of those expectations outside of a good story, outside of working with their editor? What are some of those expectations that you have for an author that you could say, would apply to anybody?
Well, I mean, when we receive a manuscript, we expect or we hope to see something that somebody's spent a lot of time working on and perfecting, and making it into, a finished product. Because that's, I got to say that most of the things I've rejected over the years, stories or novel manuscripts, it comes down to this: the writer sent it out long before it was ready to go out. Mm-hmm. What they've sent me is more like a first draft.
Right.
So I expect something beyond that. Because I don't think another thing that I think some beginning writers don't realize is an editor at a publishing house is an acquisitions editor, not consultative editor, not a book doctor. That's a totally different thing.
Yeah, they're not
But I
editing your
think that a
content.
lot
They're
of
looking
times-
for something that they want to sell. Yeah.
Right. They're looking for a product that it doesn't have to be perfect. I mean, that would be great. It doesn't have to be perfect.
Yeah.
Nothing's really perfect anyway, but it doesn't have to be like close to perfect. But it needs to be in an advanced stage where you can see that not only it's not just a draft, with a story that's got, some possibilities, but it's actually close to the end of what it needs to have done to it to be in a publishable state, if that makes sense. Not something that's early on, like a first draft. I think a lot of people may not even realize that, you need to edit things because it's not just a letter, it's a book. So that's what I expect, first of all, is I expect to see professionalism, first of all, in the product that they submit to us, even if it's not, like I said, at the perfect end stage, but I can see that it's getting there, that it's getting close. Because, like I said, acquisitions editors have a different job. They're supposed to be looking at a product that's close to ready, and they have to look at a lot of things a day, and meanwhile, they're working on a lot of other books in other stages. Whereas, if you were taking your book to an editor who was going to help you fix it, get it into shape, expand it, polish it, that's a process that can take months just working on one book. So there's no way acquisitions editors can do both. They would never get to the other work. So I think that a lot of times people hear the word editor and they think that's what an editor will do. They'll fix my book. So they send me their draft, and that's not what an acquisitions editor does. So they need to understand that. Of course, if they've gotten past that and into our, and had been acquired by us, then clearly they did pretty much grasp that. But I think a lot of the people that I've rejected really didn't understand that that's how it works.
I think one of the groups I'm in, they call it the minimum viable product, and it's like if you have the good bones and there's work, I mean, like it doesn't have to be perfect, it doesn't have to be polished all the way, right? But it has to have at least, like you said, in the advanced stage or whatever, and I feel like that's an important thing. Like one of the gaps that people, because I talk to a lot of different authors, I talk to, folks from all ranges and whatever. And, but I don't talk to a lot of publishing agents, other than like, people that have small print publishing. Right. And I don't talk to, folks, like literary agents or whatever, but, from my understanding, back in the day, you'd have a literary agent who would then shop your story around to different publishers or whatever. And so there's still agents out there, but a lot of folks have, kind of cut out the middleman, cliche or whatever. And, they're going, like you said, the information's available on, all you have to do, you go to simonschuster.com and, you're going to find some kind of email to contact them, maybe not necessarily somebody's email to send them, a transcript of your, manuscript or whatever, but there's stuff out there and people have lists and that kind of thing. But that doesn't mean you should send unsolicited stuff. And I really, it's not so much, I don't want to say it's a pet peeve, but it goes back to that professionalism of, okay, did you just throw something together? I mean, like going back to the cheeseburger thing, I'm not trying to sound funny, but they could teach you how to make cheeseburgers at a fast food joint in like 10 minutes, and the concept. You already know before you go in there of how to make a cheeseburger if you've ever eaten a cheeseburger in your life, but they teach you in like about 10 minutes on how to do that. Now that cheeseburger at a fast food joint is not going to be the same as if you go to like a little upscale restaurant that you want to get a cheeseburger and they offer them. It's not going to be the same, because the type of meat that they use, the buns, the condiments, the other things. And I feel like sometimes people just throw stuff together and they're like, hey, boom, here it is. And if you take pride in your work, if you take, if you really love that concept that you came up with or that idea that you had, spend the time putting the work into it. Spend the time trying to, to understand, and if you want to self-publish, there's nothing wrong with that. I don't think there's anything wrong with self-publishing. But if you want to put something out there, that is going to connect with readers, just give it more than a one pass through or, whatever, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. I think when I think about it, I think of, in terms of publishing, I think there's kind of two kinds of people who are looking at publishing. There's the people who want to be writers, who are really into the process and they want to learn. They take pride in it. They want to learn how to be the best possible writer of whatever genre, because I don't believe there's a difference between literary genre. There's just good writing. There's good books. It doesn't matter what genre it is. They want to, but within the confines of whatever they're doing, they want to be, if not the best, they want to be, skilled. They want to be excellent. They want to turn out a really good product, which is their book story. And they really care about that. And those people, some of them make a lot of money, some of them make a little money, some of them may be publishing with, small presses or literary, short story collections where they don't make money or a lot of money, but they still get a great deal of satisfaction out of that process because it's an art or a craft. You can call it either one, it's both. And I think, though, there's a disconnect because it's an art or a craft. The same people wouldn't expect to pick up a hammer and chisel out, Michelangelo's David in a weekend.
Right.
They've never picked up a hammer and a chisel, but they know how to type. They know how to type, and they know how to run a computer. So it seems like, well, then, therefore, I can write a novel. With it's kind of like a huge leap over the craft part of the process. Either because they just really don't grasp it, they don't know that all those really good books they've been reading, that author basically sweated and struggled and worked like a dog to get that out.
Yeah.
That they just sat down and typed it out and sent it off, in a few days, and that's not how that book came about. They don't understand that process. Or then there's people, I think the other hand, so there's the people that want to be writers, okay? Then there's the other people who I don't think they even grasp that part of the process or even sometimes care. They want to be authors.
Mm-hmm.
That's different because somebody who wants to be a writer and feels driven to be a writer, they're going to write regardless, even if they never get published. That's something they're going to do because they feel compelled to do it and they care about it. And then there's people who I think they want to see, and I'm not making fun of them. I mean, I understand because it's a really powerful thing. They want to see their name on a book.
Yeah, they want the prestige of being an author.
Show their book and say, I'm an author.
Mm-hmm.
And that is part of the process for everybody, for writers too, but for them, that's the main part of the process, or maybe the only part of the process they're really, really interested in.
That's like every
And
musician
so
I've ever met. They want to be,
pay
the
any
best
attention
or
to
whatever.
the rest of the process. And Amazon makes that very possible to do.
Well, yeah, it does. It does. I mean, but that's the same. You could say the same thing about like SoundCloud with musicians. It's not just Amazon. It's the internet. I mean, and it's whatever entertainment, like movie making. Anybody and everybody can be a filmmaker now. The thing is, I think too, though, is like you have folks that. And I mean, you should go for your goals. I really do. I feel like you should shoot for it. You could be, whatever you want to be with it. I just am saying be professional about, especially working with publishers or working with an editor or, whatever. Let me do a station ID and then I want to talk about something else real quick. Everybody, you listen to WRUULP Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM. WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings Community Radio with Global Soul. So I want to bring back up. We were talking about Ray Bradbury yesterday, and I want to talk about that. So everybody, I was a friend of mine had shared one of those old school black and white. And by the way, I want to give a shout out to Terry and Darlene Dremel. They just sent me a text message saying that they're listening. So thank y'all. Appreciate that. But yeah, so a friend of mine shared this black and white, like one of those old school, like a day in the life of a writer of Ray Bradbury. Something you would see back in the day when we were kids in school or whatever. And at the end of that video, there was another video of him talking at a school in 2001. It was like a lecture or a speech or a talk or whatever you want to call it. And something that he was saying in it was that if you want to be a better writer, learn metaphors. And if you want to be a better writer, read a poem, a short story, and an essay once a night, or read one a night for the next 1,000 nights. And he said, people that are negative in your life, get them out of there. If they don't believe in your goal or your dream or whatever, get them out of there. And I, for the last 14 days, I've been doing that, reading an essay and a poem and a short story. And I love the fact, because, like I had mentioned with you talking, the only thing I'd ever read of Ray Bradbury's was the Fahrenheit 451, which is a compulsory read in like 9th grade English.
Yeah. The usual
Yeah. And I think that's what most people associate him with, that they maybe have, like me. I mean, I'm 44. I'd never read anything of his besides that. But I have been falling in love. I mean, I've read 14 of his short stories, in the last 14 days. And, talk about story crafting and talk about, that. And you had kind of a neat story to share about Ray Bradbury, right?
Well, I have several Ray Bradbury stories, I guess, but yeah, I mean, I feel really fortunate because when I was a kid and growing up, and in high school and junior high, or as we called middle school then, I read a lot of Ray Bradbury's stories. I mean, I've read all his collections. I've still got a lot of those original copies on my shelves, and so Ray Bradbury was always one of my favorite, if not the favorite, at least at certain points, writer. And the person that I read, his, The Illustrated Man was one of my most favorite ones, I guess, and The October Country, too, and Something Wicked, This Way Comes. All of those books, they mean a great deal to me. And I think that, I mean, not to go back into the Night Bazaar, but I think that his writing and his collections and the way he characterizes, just so vivid. All his stories have people that you can really relate to, whether or not you read fantasy or science fiction or horror, you can really relate to those people, as if they were stories aimed at anybody. So I think that his kind of writing and what he was trying to achieve, I tried to put a little bit of that in the Night Bazaar. It's that kind of story that's not hard science fiction that would exclude some readers, and it's not fantasy of just a certain kind that would exclude some readers. He's got that kind of overall everyman type of fantasy or science fiction story that you don't have to be a lover of the genre to appreciate. So that's kind of what I was going for. So yeah, Ray Bradbury is one of my longtime favorites, and I was really fortunate back in around 1996, I guess. I remember because my daughter was really small to be able to meet him. We were at a writers' conference that we were giving workshops and reading at, and Ray Bradbury turned out to be the keynote speaker. So I got to spend a whole evening with him. And one thing that I found out about him that I didn't know, but I probably could have guessed, that he was an extremely nice person.
Yeah.
Very patient, very kind, very generous with his time, and could talk to anybody, but he also listened. It wasn't like you meet this famous person, and all they want to do is talk about themselves, and if you change the subject, their eyes glaze over, you can kind of see it happening, He was not at all like that. He was totally the opposite, very kind and very, very nice. And I talked to him for a long time, and since I knew he was going to be there, I brought along a lot of my books and got them signed, so that was like really thrilling. But he also, while I was talking to him, he told me an interesting story, and this would be a good story for writers who are maybe feeling a little depressed or, should I keep going on? He told me once that he wrote a short story back in 1960, and he got to the end and he couldn't think of an ending. And he said, I tried for weeks. I'd pull the story out. This is back when, the days of typewriters. I'd work on it. I'd type a little more. I'd go, pick up the page, wad it up, throw it away. He said, I finally gave up, but I never throw anything away, so I put it in a drawer in my desk. And he had this huge wooden desk. And then, over the decades, over the next 30 years, he and the desk moved from California to somewhere else, Texas, to New York City, and then back to California. And so 30 years later, he said, well, I was going through the desk, and I thought, I really got to clean this desk out. And he pulled open that drawer, and he said, I pulled that story out, and I read it, and I thought, well, yeah, of course. And I wrote the ending right then, and I sent it off and published it.
Wow.
It only took him 30 years to come up with the ending.
Something I loved about listening to him, because I feel like even though I've known his name, I really haven't known him or read his stories until, the last 2 weeks. One of the things I loved was that he was talking about, he didn't go to college. He, grew up in the libraries, and he earned his education in the library, spending 10 years in the library, and writing every day and reading. And he said that if he were the question, if you were stuck on a deserted island, what books would you take or whatever, and he said that he would take a copy of the Bible, he would take William Shakespeare's complete works, and he would take George Bernard Shaw's complete works. And then he listed off, like in this speech, and I took screenshots. Actually, what I did was, like, each time he would list off an author that he liked, I'd say, Siri, who is so and so, and it would come up with like a little wiki and a picture, and I just did a screenshot of that. But he listed off like a dozen or so different authors that he enjoyed, reading, and I was thinking, wow, talking about being humble and down to earth, and here's a guy, and I think people have the thought that it's I don't know how to say it, but if back in the day before the internet, if you were published, it was easier to get published again. It's kind of like if you have a job today, it's easier to find another job. If you're not working, it's harder to find a job. I don't know why it is like that or whatever. But going back to your point about the publishing, with if you've got a self-published book, there are some rare exceptions, like The Martian, for example, where somebody's book just blows up and then it gets acquired or whatever. But that's like 1 out of 10 million maybe or whatever. And so like me with my my first little novella, I've got 13 reviews. You know what I mean? I love every one of those people that reviewed my book. But even if I were to say, hey, let me shop this around, that's going to be one of the things. Have you published this before? Like, I was setting up an Ingram Spark account today because I want to be able to publish books and have the option for bookstores to pick them up. And I've been using Amazon. And one of the things that they ask you is, have you published a Kindle book in the last 12 months? Yes or no? Because if you have, then we can't enter into an agreement, even though Ingram Spark uses Amazon's publishing for Kindle and that kind of thing. They also use other avenues for you to be able, like you can get a hardback or paperback or whatever. So, it kind of, to me, it goes back to like with when I'm tying it back around to Ray Bradbury and the publishing and the self-publishing and all that. You don't have to have a degree. You don't have to have whatever, but you do need to know your craft. You do need to master your craft. And there's a lot of different ways. Like, you can go to a writing workshop. You can join a writing group. Like, there's a million different ways. But the major part of it, I feel like, is you have to write, you have to learn, you have to grow, you have to keep going. And I feel that's, one of the things I'm loving about, reading Ray Bradbury and doing this, I'm calling it the Ray Bradbury 1,000-Day Challenge. So I'm on day 14, but I'm enjoying it so much because, what's 14 times 3? 52, something like that? No, it can't be 42. I'm not, like, my math is off. Yeah, 42. So I've read, in the last 14 days, I've read 42 different pieces of literature that I wouldn't have read. And I read every day. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think that's important. I think a lot of people who do read a lot sometimes just read the same thing kind of over and over. I mean, because they like it, But if you're a writer, I think that if you don't, you need to vary what you read because you can learn different things. Like you're reading poetry. You said something about metaphor. Oh, Ray Bradbury saying learn how to use metaphors. And you're reading poetry, right? And that's teaching you, and I would imagine, an incredible amount about the use of imagery and metaphor.
Yeah, Shakespeare's sonnets. Yeah, that's what I've been reading. So, and I write poetry as well, and I love poetry. So, Lenore, thank you so much for being my guest the last 2 hours. And please let Aphrodite and David also thank them as well, because I really enjoyed having them on this last hour where they did some readings for us and all. So where can people, just one website or whatever, where can people check out your publishing?
Well, if they're interested in my work, I have an author website. It's LenoreHart.com, and everything is up there. So that's an easy place to look.
And then the anthology, what's the website? Is the Northampton?
For the anthology, it's up there as well. But for Northampton House Press, if they check out Northampton-house.com, they can find both Night Bazaars.
Awesome.
And then there are sales links to all the different sales venues.
Awesome.
If they're interested in buying it, they can take them right to that.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Lenore. I really appreciate you being on the show.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity, and I enjoyed our talk.
Awesome. All right.